Good morning and welcome to the Lightcast studios for this JOLTS live analysis. JOLTS standing for Job Openings Labor Turnover Survey, a Bureau of Labor Statistics monthly report that gives us some indication into the health of our economy. On this May 2nd, 2023, I'm your host, Christopher Laney, and I am joined by the dynamic duo of economic knowledge. We have senior labor economist Elizabeth Crowfoot and senior labor economist Layla O'Kane. Elizabeth and Layla, welcome to the studio.
Thanks, Chris. Good morning. Good to be here.
Good to be with you. Layla, I'm going to start with you. So on the surface, it seems like there's not a lot going on in this report, but from February to March, what's your first impression and what are you seeing in this report?
I think this is basically meeting expectations. We've seen openings tick down a little bit. That's what we were hoping for. Quits are staying about the same, and layoffs have sort of ticked up, but not a lot. I think that this is kind of what was expected and continuing that trend of cooling the labor market off, but pretty slowly.
Elizabeth, we want to make sure that the JOLTS report doesn't get buried behind a whole bunch of economic news that's happening right now over the next couple of days. And so what's your first take? Are we seeing, like Layla alluded to, the cooling effect that's happening in our labor market right now?
Definitely. I think this plays according to plan, right? The Fed is really hoping that the job market's going to soften, and with this decrease in job openings, they're down a little bit, about 4%, and also layoffs are up quite a bit, about 16% uptick there. So it is cooling the labor market significantly. And like you said, there's so much other data that's happening, especially with all the turmoil in the banking sector. I think the Fed really has its job cut out for it this week in terms of looking at all the data, looking at the environment holistically, and trying to make a decision based on all of those factors.
You kind of talked about this. I want to get a take from both of you on what's happening in regards to separations this month. It does seem like the quits rate is decreasing, or has decreased, or stayed about the same. And then we saw that involuntary separations or layoffs creep up this month. So obviously what we've been seeing in the news is a lot about layoffs. So I wanted to get your thought on what we're seeing. Do we believe that employees are starting to back off a little bit and realizing there's a lot going on right now, so maybe I should keep my job? So Layla, I'll start with you and then jump over to Elizabeth.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's starting to play out. So as Elizabeth mentioned, we did see layoffs tick up quite a bit in this report. And I think one of the sectors that, everybody's thinking about and has been thinking about is tech. And so I kind of looked specifically for layoffs in that sector. And what we are seeing is that layoffs are up in professional and business services, which is where a decent amount of sort of the tech sector lives. But they're not up in information. Layoffs are actually down in information. And so I think, which is another sort of sector where a lot of the tech companies live in this industry data. So I think we are seeing overall those sort of layoffs tick up. And I think it's not as much an employees market as it was earlier this year and late last year.
Elizabeth, what's your thoughts on what we're seeing in terms of those separations?
Yeah, we're also seeing some layoffs in wholesale trade and transportation and warehousing. And I think that just speaks to the slowdown of the overall economy, especially in the goods sector. We have seen manufacturing weakness in the last several months as well. So it's just part of that narrative of slowing down the economy. And it starts with those good producing sectors, while consumers are still very actively spending money on services. So it's just that ongoing narrative.
There was something I saw in this report that was quite interesting. Earlier this year, we saw the news of the major layoffs that were happening among all these major employers. And yeah, that wasn't necessarily showing up in our data. And so moving forward, we were like, well, maybe they're getting jobs at some of these small businesses that were able to compete for wages or whatnot. However, in the data here, we saw that the layoffs were really happening among small businesses, and it was pretty unchanged among those big corporations. Elizabeth, I'll start with you. What's your thoughts on, we see in the news, it's the big corporations that get the headlines, but really some of these small businesses are the ones that are having to lay off employees.
And to be honest, I want to link this back to some of the banking turmoil that we've been seeing, because it is happening more in those small regional banks. And the main customers in those areas are small and medium-sized businesses. So that's the area of the economy that's feeling the credit crunch, those tightening financial conditions that ultimately leads into lower employment in those businesses. So I'm not entirely surprised that that's where we're seeing the layoffs, is because those that's the area that's really feeling the pressure of these tightening in financial conditions.
Leila, anything you would add to that from what you're seeing here?
Yeah, I just want to agree. I mean, I think, of course, the news always focuses on big players because those are household names. Those are companies that people know. But really, a lot of economic activity plays out in small businesses that we just never see. And this is an opportunity to kind of bring that to light and really acknowledge that, if you're a small business owner and you are facing capital issues and sort of cost issues, then yeah, you're kind of facing a crunch, and that might be happening and affecting your business right now.
And just to piggyback on that, what Layla was saying is small businesses employ the majority of workers in the US. So that's where you're going to see most of the churn in the economy. And, that is really playing out in these data.
Elizabeth, let me stay with you for just a second. Industry data, looking at the specifics. I know both of you have already alluded to some of the industries that are winning and losing in some of these areas. One example that we saw is in like food and accommodations, where those quit rates are much lower than they were last month or the month before, but yet there is still layoffs that's occurring in that industry. What surprises you when you look at the industry data? Who's winning, who's losing in this area?
Actually, when it comes to the industry data, what really caught my eye was healthcare and all the layoffs that are happening there. Generally, that is an industry that always sees a lot of demand, and we have an aging population. We need healthcare services, so seeing those layoffs were quite interesting. And we're talking or chatting previously before going live about some of the nursing coming back to hospitals from like travel nurses, right? Those wage rates are coming down a little bit. So it seems like there's a shift in the medical industry right now, where nursing may be shifting from really high wage, high pressure demand areas to, going back to where that demand, or those hospital areas where those jobs are, where we're seeing those jobs more. And of course, that's just additional churn in the labor market that we're seeing in that particular sector.
Yeah, I want to come back to the nurses conversation in just a second. I just want to touch on Layla. Anything you would see in the industry data that really caught your eye or surprised you?
Yeah, I think two things. One is that in accommodation and food services, we're seeing layoffs up pretty substantially, but we're also seeing openings up. And so it seems like there's sort of a shuffling going on in accommodation and food services. And I think Elizabeth touched on how people are still spending money on services, and I'm going to expect that to continue. And so it seems like there's just some shuffling going on from business to business there. And then the other thing I think we would be remiss if we didn't mention is construction, right? Construction had the most layoffs this month of all sectors. And, to be honest, I don't have good intuition as to why that is. It might be that there are a lack of capital in, commercial construction that might be constraining folks, but I would expect that to have been happening for the last few months already. And so it being sort of acute this month is surprising. And I'm interested to see if that plays out next month as well.
Yeah, that's really good insight there for us to kind of investigate a little bit further. And perhaps have a follow-up post or something of that nature.
Yeah.
I wanted to go back, Elizabeth, you were alluding to what we're seeing in the nurses coming back to work, or traditional work. And this question's really for both of you, because it was interesting. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday talking about how that kind of temporary nurse environment was down almost 21% over this last month. And yet from the beginning of the year, a lot of those nurses are returning back to back to hospitals. A lot of hospitals are citing upwards of 20-30% of individuals coming back into those traditional roles. What do you think? Do you think similar to what we're seeing in other industries, do we see that it's starting to play out where essentially we can't afford these wages anymore? We just need to get nurses back into this work. And those nurses that were accustomed to those high wages are realizing that's starting to dry up. Is that what do you believe that's what we're seeing?
Just to jump in there, I think what you're seeing in that healthcare sector is similar systemic in the labor market as a whole. And Layla mentioned this. There's a lot of reshuffling going on as wages increase and decrease in certain sectors. And there are similarly skilled individuals or have adjacent skills that can move across sectors to other positions that may be able to give them a little bit more of a bump in their salary, for example. So that's just the nature of what we've been seeing over the last couple of years, with those wage rates really attracting workers to other areas. And that's, what's happening essentially in the healthcare system as well. So it's just, continuing labor market churn. I think that's my word of the day is churn.
Yeah, we last year we talked a lot about the reshuffling. We talked a lot about that in the labor market, and it seems like that's still playing out here in 2023. Layla, anything that you would add in reference to what we're seeing in the healthcare industry?
Yeah, I think the other thing I would add is that, the travel nursing and the sort of high paid nursing opportunities that do exist, they still exist, but they require a lot of instability in your life and in your work. And I think that people are starting to feel like they want some more stability back. They want to stay in one place. They want to have a contract for longer than a few months at a time. They're not sure what the economy is going to look like. And so this uncertainty is sort of pushing them back into a little bit more of a stable position. And I think that's what we're seeing in that return to nurses in hospitals.
Super helpful. Layla, let me start with you. Your final thoughts on this month's JOLTS report.
Yeah, I think, this is a little bit like when you're making like a hard-boiled egg and you're trying to time exactly to get that soft middle or that soft landing. And the Fed is thinking, when do I take those out of the boiling water and plunge them into the ice bath and stop the process that's happening? And I think we're approaching that nice jammy center, and we're hopefully not going to get to the point where it's too hard-boiled and overdone. Layoffs going up is leading us to sort of feel like, we could get there maybe sooner than we had expected, because they did go up by a substantial amount. And so I think, let's look at Friday's report for unemployment. Let's see what that looks like. The Fed is going to be collecting all of this information and thinking about when they want to do the ice bath plunge for the labor market.
This is exactly why I don't make hard-boiled eggs, because I'll never get it right. Elizabeth, exactly. your final thoughts.
Yeah, I really love that analogy, actually. And just similarly with thinking about the Fed's decision this week, I mean, this is one data point, right, in the entire mix that we saw, especially last week. We saw GDP coming down significantly to 1.1%. We know inflation has been coming down. Wages have been a little sticky, but also gradually coming down. And now we see job openings cooling as well. So again, it's that continuing narrative of that soft landing. Hopefully we'll be able to take that boiling egg out of the water. But, there's so much going on, especially with all this banking news, and that in and of itself tightens credit conditions further. So it'll be interesting to see what the Fed ultimately decides to do this week.
Elizabeth, Layla, thank you so much for this conversation. If you want more information about this data or any additional Lightcast data, you can visit lightcast.io. We will be back here on Friday for the monthly jobs report. We hope to see you then.